And for more on the economic ties between China and Germany, we're joined by Andrew Karolyi. He's Professor of Finance at the Cornell University. Andrew, many thanks indeed for joining us. What a week it's been. We had President Xi Jinping lining up with Vladimir Putin to sort of take on Donald Trump, if you like. Now we have Angela Merkel and Xi Jinping with a very, very different view of how they view global trade. Angela Merkel talking in her news conference with Xi Jinping and basically saying that Donald Trump believes in this sort of gladiatorial style relations, whereas Xi and President Xi, much more open, much more collaborative. What do you make of all that?
Well, I agree with your assessment, Owen, and thank you very much for having me on. You know, I just watch all of these deliberations and all this, these actions that precede the G20, and it just reminds me how intricately linked are politics with the economics of doing business in these types of multilateral types of settings. I see lots of upside. You know, when I size up these types of deliberations, these preemptive types of events, I try to deconstruct for the respective parties what one gains at the expense of others, how third parties are affected. There's no question that this is clearly a pivot from Germany to China for their greater good and economic benefit. I see China gaining in so many dimensions. They clearly have a long view of this relationship with Europe and Germany and Chancellor Merkel. And it is, we can clearly see the potential negative consequences for President Trump, at least immediately in terms of the pictures that we see in this panda diplomacy. But you know that President Trump has some goals and objectives coming into the G20. So yeah, we'll be watching for that.
We certainly saw the pandas there earlier. Do you think going into the G20, of course, we're going to have all these leaders from these advanced economies wheeling and dealing, talking to people like Donald Trump? Are we really seeing the world start to divide now between people like Angela Merkel, who say free trade is the only way, and this more perhaps protectionist tendency by Donald Trump?
Well, I think that they would be very remiss if they saw this as an opportunity to fully turn away from the opportunities that are presented by greater economic relations with the U.S. And I really don't think that they intend to do that. I think they see these types of deliberations, the show of it, as an opportunity to lay down some table stakes for them to ensure better terms in negotiations with the U.S. The Airbus deal that you mentioned, Owen, today, it's a signature deal. It's a large deal, $23 billion. You know that Boeing must have been part of those potential negotiations. I'm sure that Chancellor Merkel's government was actively engaged in facilitating the deal. But you also know that there's going to be a reaction that follows. And I'm sure that Germany and China are both going to be looking for new opportunities, perhaps on better terms than they would otherwise, to follow up with the U.S. They're not going to turn their back on it.
Andrew,
on the opportunity.
One thing that caught my eye, I was surprised to hear Angela Merkel say that she wanted to go ahead with a full free trade agreement with China. Isn't she jumping the gun a bit there? I note that the European Union is only really talking about an investment agreement before they start talking about free trade.
That's right.
Isn't she jumping the gun a little bit?
Well, I read it as one step at a time, Owen. I see that an investment agreement is something that is high priority. Remember, she's also involved in a political election cycle coming up on September for re-election. And I'm sure that she's seeing opportunities to show her worth to her own population. Now, I think an investment agreement is the first step. There's been a lot of concerns about acquisitions by Chinese companies in Europe. And there are laws in place to try to protect the best interests and securities of Europe. I'm seeing her intentions there with the investment agreement as basically righting the table and try to equilibrate or right-size the table of negotiations there. I wouldn't be surprised if further deals, multilateral, bilateral or multilateral negotiations between the EU and China follow in terms of trade.
Very briefly, Andrew, you did preempt my final question. There are concerns, though, not just from German companies, but the European Union about things like intellectual property protection in China. She has to be aware of this, Angela Merkel, when she's talking about these kinds of deals.
Oh, there's no question about it. You know, these are probably some of the things you and I both won't see in front of the lenses of the cameras in these types of discussions, but I suspect behind the scenes, discussions about human rights, intellectual property, all of those things are probably also being actively discussed.
Andrew Karolyi from